Let me read your bio. Let me read your bio here, Josh. Josh Thomas is a principal planner with the Delaware Office of State Planning Coordination, where he is responsible for the coordination of land use planning in Kent County. This includes implementing the state strategies for policies and spending, coordinating plan reviews in the preliminary land use service, and coordinating the comprehensive plans for 21 local governments. Prior to OSPC, Josh spent nearly 14 years with the Delaware Department of Transportation Division of Planning, where he was responsible for long-range transportation planning and programming. Josh is an AICP certified planner. He is also proud to serve as president of the Delaware chapter of the American Planning Association. Thanks, Josh. Over to you.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. On behalf of the Delaware chapter of the APA, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today during your lunch hour. And don't worry, if we call on you and your camera's off or there's a delay to unmute, it's okay. We know you're just, took a big bite of your sandwich or something. So, so thank you for taking the time to be with us. And we really thank the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration for allowing Delaware to host the webinar today. But I really want to note that this is definitely a collaborative effort. Several of the folks online today played integral roles in getting all of the pieces of the puzzle to fit together. So this is really a joint effort. And I really can't say enough about the Mid-Atlantic Collaboration. In my role with the Delaware chapter, this has been a great resource for us. And it really started during the pandemic when we had to learn how to connect better in the digital space. And through this effort, I really have met the greatest people. And it allows all the different chapters to expand their reach. And it's, for a webinar that our chapter would have run, during a lunch hour, we wouldn't have nearly as many attendees as we have right now. So that's just fantastic. We've got attendees up and down the East Coast. So I really just want to thank that collaboration for helping us expand our reach. And because of this reach, I do want to just take a brief minute to promote our chapter's upcoming virtual fall conference. And that will be on October 5th and October 6th. We just closed our call for abstracts. We are reviewing all of them now and they look excellent. So I would just encourage you to watch the Delaware APA website for updates. And if you'd like to learn more about our chapter's events, please join our mailing list, which can also be done from our website, delawareapa.org. And I can put that in the chat. We'll only bug you with about 2 emails a month, so it's not that many. With that, I'm going to keep my introductions short and sweet. I want to make sure we have time for all of our panelists today. So I am happy to kick off our panel discussion. And our speakers, myself included, will be discussing a variety of tools and resources that we use in our individual organizations and kind of collectively to protect the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So a pretty simple format. I'm going to introduce each of the panel members. Each panelist is going to give a brief talk, and then like our hosts have mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. I do believe, though, if you put your questions in Q&A, we can try to answer some questions live as well, just to make sure we get everyone's questions answered. So we are actually a little bit ahead of schedule, so we'll get going. And I have the pleasure of introducing Casey Filippino, who's going to be talking about land use and water quality in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Casey is a senior water resources planner at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. She is a native of Pennsylvania, received an undergrad degree in Delaware, and now resides in Norfolk, Virginia, after receiving her PhD in oceanography at Old Dominion University. At HRPDC, she monitors Chesapeake Bay program developments and TMDL implementation for the member localities within the Bay watershed. She is very involved in the Bay program's partnership as a member of several work groups and a co-chair to the land use work group. So I want to thank you, Casey, and you should be able to share your screen and get started.
All right, are we good?
We're good. We hear you loud and clear.
Awesome, thanks. Great, well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. It's really nice being a part of these kinds of conversations because, and having everybody in the whole watershed here, because I'm a native of Pennsylvania. And so I saw somebody here from where I grew up, Susquehanna Township, and somebody from where I'm living right now in Norfolk, Virginia. So it's just so nice to see this broad watershed scale conversation happening right now. So I'm just going to be really brief today, but I'm going to talk a little bit about land use and water quality in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and how all of those pieces fit together. I'm going to try to set the stage today with talking about 4 big topics. I'd really like to spend more time on every single one of these topics individually, but that's kind of tricky to do in this time frame. So just bear with me if some of this is new to you or you're not familiar with it all, or if you're outside of the watershed, I can understand that. But I think that I'm going to try to touch on each one of these as best I can, give you the information so you can get some of these resources yourself. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about water quality and land use planning and how those interrelate, then how all of that feeds into the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, and how that Bay TMDL is created with a variety of models, including land use and loadings in terms of nutrients from the land uses. And I'm going to introduce the very brand new data set that hopefully some of you are aware of from the land use work group and from the Chesapeake Bay program, USGS, and the Chesapeake Conservancy with our new high-res land use data set, and how that data can then be used for your purposes. So very briefly, obviously we know that what happens on the land impacts our waters. We do know that when it rains and water hits impervious surfaces or structures or lawns, it brings with it whatever's on those landscapes, whether it's nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that's particular to the Bay TMDL or other pollutants. We know that all of that stuff, those pollutants are getting into our local waterways through the storm drains, the gutters, or directly impacting our rivers. We also know that impervious surfaces generate more runoff. When you have a lot of runoff, this can cause increased erosion, less infiltration, so less ability for anything like vegetation or trees or plants to remove those pollutants from the water and treat them appropriately. And that, of course, then introduces pollutions. I really like this infographic here because it's a nice segue of what happens when we have natural ground cover and vegetated cover. We have less runoff, more infiltration, more evapotranspiration. And then as you transition into increasing those areas with impervious surfaces, of course, you're going to increase the runoff and decrease infiltration. So it's just a nice way to say, what we put on the landscape is really going to impact our waterways. And that leads to water quality and water quality impairments. This is a map of our region down in Hampton Roads in Virginia. And the yellow is an impairment of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. Those are what we deal with in terms of dealing with the pollution diet for the Chesapeake Bay. And that's the impairment for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And we have other impairments as well, just like most regions in the Bay watershed, are going to have maps that look like this. And this is a nice infographic that lives on askhrgreen.org, which is our environmental education arm at HRPDC. And it kind of shows you where some of these pollutants are coming from and how they can harm our region. Of course, as I mentioned, runoff increases nutrients or other pollutants and leads to impaired waterways. You can have increased algae blooms. With those increased algae blooms, when they decay, you have lower dissolved oxygen within the water. And then these impairments can then lead to total maximum daily loads. So that's where we come into the Bay TMDL. And I know that this group has been talking about the Bay TMDL as a whole, and this is the end of that. So I'm not going to belabor the point about the Bay TMDL. Just to note that it is a pollution diet, of course, to decrease the source loads from the land. And it's an iterative process, and it's been going on for a long time within the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, where all the partners are doing water quality monitoring and assessments to see how the water's doing. Do we have high or low DO? What are our impairments? And then there's a suite of models that model the loading rates and estuarine processes. So the loading rates from the landscape and then how those enter into the estuary and what those processes are and how that impacts the bay itself. And then partners and jurisdictions, local, federal, state, they all try to implement best management practices and policies. And so implementing those will help reduce nutrients from the landscape, from wastewater treatment plants, reduce what's happening from atmospheric deposition, et cetera. And then all of that gets back into this feedback loop and evaluated again into modeled results. This is a loop that just keeps going throughout the Bay Program Partnership. And that, I think, is kind of in a nutshell how this all works, where we're monitoring and assessing and implementing and always trying to see how we're doing to achieve the goal by 2025. So as I mentioned, land use, or the Chesapeake Bay is a suite of models. And what I want to just kind of show you today is the connection between land use in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model and how that's impacting, your local waterways in the Bay as a whole. So we have the suite of models is what they call it. The phase 6 is the watershed model, and that's built with a lot of different inputs. We've got all kinds of data going into it. And one of the major backbones of those data sources is the land use data. And as chair of the land use work group, that's where we help the Chesapeake Conservancy, the USGS, the Chesapeake Bay Program, and all the other partners get the best data available to put into that model. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. But that watershed model feeds the estuary model, which tells us actually how we're doing within the water column itself. What is our dissolved oxygen looking like in comparison to those monitored data points? So it's connecting the model loads to the measured water quality endpoints. And again, those modeled loads are a combination of point and non-point sources and atmospheric deposition. And the non-point sources are generally based on land use. And that's like I said, the fundamental backbone of the watershed model. There's also a land use change model that fits into all of this. That model helps the Bay Program assess how we're going in time and how we're going to meet the goals in 2025. So essentially, it's assessing growth and predicting where they think growth is going to occur throughout the watershed. And you can, jurisdictions have been tasked in the past to actually say, I'm going to do this certain land use planning exercise, and it will be put in to the land use change model, and let's see if that actually helps with the loads or the pollutions within the estuary itself. So there's a lot that goes on with all of these models. And the major focus, of course, today is land use. And as I mentioned, land use data is really key to that model. Historically, the most recent high resolution data set was implemented in about 2016, and that was based on 2013 imagery. And it was high resolution. It was really good data, and it had a lot of classification schemas in it. And that was the best data at the time. And that was put into the suite of models. It's called the CAST, is the big term for all the models together, the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool. And prior to 2013, the data was a little bit coarser. It was at 30-meter scale. I believe it was based on NLCD. So all of that data has been improved upon iteratively over the years. Now, fast forward to 2018, Chesapeake Bay Program, EPA, put forth a cooperative agreement with the Chesapeake Conservancy, and it's the Chesapeake Innovation Center. I believe that's the arm of the Chesapeake Conservancy that's doing all this work in cooperation with USGS and other partners, University of Vermont, several people, several different consultants on this cooperative agreement. It's covering 4 objectives. One of the objectives was to produce even better high resolution, 1 meter high resolution land cover land use data set for the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership on a watershed-wide scale. So they did that, and it's available. It became available fully in May, just about a month ago. And they developed land cover land use and a change product, which I'll talk about here in a minute, for all the counties within the watershed based on 2017, 2018 MAPE imagery and ancillary data. They also remapped the 1314 product using the classification schema that they developed for the 2017-18 land use land cover data sets. When I also say this data is produced for all counties, if a county is only partially within a watershed, within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, they still map to the whole county. So some of my localities were partially in the watershed, but the whole county data set is available, which is really nice. Unfortunately, the whole state of Virginia wasn't remapped this time, so we don't have a statewide data set, but what we do have is for the watershed. And so that's what this is all available for you on this slide. And I believe Laura has all the resources available in handouts that will be coming out. But There is a website and materials available. The Chesapeake Conservancy put together this website. We have a data viewer that has a slider, and you can zoom in and out for locality. I'm not going to dive into the details of any of this. I'm not going to do like a demo. That would take a lot of time, but you can slide back and forth and look at land cover versus land use. And they have the data viewer for the 17-18 data set. And then they also have a lot of descriptions. So defining all those classifications, there are 18 broad classifications like land, like water, wetlands, impervious, agricultural, stuff like that. And then within those classifications are subclassifications. There are 54 of those. All those details are in the documentation on that website, as well as the methodology used to develop those classifications. All of this information and work was run through the land use work group with the Bay Program Partnership, with all the hard work happening in the background at the Conservancy and in the USGS land use data team. And then you can also go here and just download county specific GIS files for land cover and land use data for that remapped 13-14 data set, as well as the 17-18 data set. In addition to this, first of its kind land use change data was developed. And that is changing from the 2013-14 imagery and what changed over time to 17-18. So those 4 years of land use change are also available. You can go to this viewer, the image on the right shows that, and you're going to get something like this. This is just a zoom in here of the 13-14 NAPE imagery viewer on the left, the 17-18 NAPE imagery on the right, and the actual change product on the far right. And so in 13-14 in this particular area, this was all considered forest. And then it became low vegetation in 17-18. And this, sort of green blob here you can click on, and it will tell you this landscape changed from forest to low vegetation. What's great about this is we're doing this all over again. Right now, they are mapping and processing the data and mapping for 2021 and 2022 NAPE imagery. So this will be another 4 years later data set. And what that's going to tell you, if you look at the Google Earth for this panel here on the right, these are all solar fields now. So you will have another change product that's going to tell you this went from forest to low veg to solar in 2022 or 2021. So all of that is available as well at the website. And you can download this GIS shape file for the change product itself on a county by county scale. And also they've provided a matrix of change in Excel spreadsheets, either the change going from the 18 classification to 18 classification for the 13, 14, 17, 18, or all 54 of those classification changes. It's a lot to process. It's a lot to look at. I encourage you to play around with this data set. It's really valuable information to have. So with that said, I decided I'll just poke around a little bit and provide some very high level pieces of information for folks. This is a watershed view of numbers that I'm going to just show you really quickly. I didn't want to get too granular in the state level, but big buckets of land use that people care about in the Bay program are things like agricultural, forested lands, and developed lands. So the Bay watershed is predominantly made up of natural acres. Of 66% of natural acres are forested lands, followed by about 21% of agricultural acres and 14% of developed acres in the watershed. And when you process that data and you put it into what's called the CAST modeling tool, if you're familiar with that, that will tell you what the loading rates are from these land uses. You can really get granular with this data set. And this is, again, really, really broad overview. But we're noting that the majority of our loads of nitrogen, so total nitrogen coming from the Bay watershed, are actually coming from agricultural lands, followed by developed lands, and then forested lands. So that's what this is telling you, is that the forested landscapes or the natural lands have the lowest loading rate per acre, which is what is to be expected. We want, the more forest you have, the less you're going to have of pollutants entering into your waterways, for example. But these are just really informative numbers to tell you that you can get down to all kinds of different levels and say, what is the loading rate happening in my locality or in my river basin or in my state? What am I concerned about in terms of this land use and this pollutant of either nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment? Again, you can't get this from downloading just the land use data. You have to start looking deeper into the modeling information that's out there. But this is just an idea of the information that you can gather. If you so choose. Another thing that I thought was interesting from the land use change product, again, this is only 4 years of change data, But we are losing significant amounts of natural or forested acres, over 300,000 acres. And most of those acres are either going into impervious and turf grass, agricultural, or what's this catch-all category called mixed open. And mixed open is, with 4 years of change, it's a tough category to sort of break open, but it's basically something that's low vegetation, or it's hard to tell based on the imagery or the ancillary data what it is exactly being used for. But a lot of times we can break this further open into harvested forest or transitional land uses that maybe it's going to go into developed, so it can be broken up, but a lot of it is going into what's considered a transitional or a mixed open land use. So just, again, more food for thought about what you can get for some of this data. And then I just kind of going to close here in the next couple of slides. My background is water quality, and every day when I talk to folks, I'm talking to folks about water quality. I don't often, even though my title says planner, water resources planner, I don't often talk to a lot of planners, and I'm really trying to rectify that a little bit more, because I think that there is a decoupling of land use planning and water quality management often. I talk a lot to stormwater managers and environmental folks in the localities, and I think that making the connection of land use planning and how that impacts our local waterways can be really, really important. And I think this data set can help bridge that gap, particularly when you're looking at the change process or the change product. So, what can we learn from this data? I mean, this is just a few things I picked, but there's so many things. We can assess conservation needs. I know that the state of Maryland is doing a healthy watersheds report that can be really valuable and is helping them identify high conservation lands, and it is using and going to be incorporating this new land use data. We can evaluate buffer protections and where can they be maximized along stream corridors. Localities can use this to assess their tree canopy change. Sometimes LiDAR data might be better depending on what scale you're looking at, but this data can be really a good broad brush analysis for assessing what's happened in your locality, and looking at development patterns and figuring out, can we start incentivizing infill and redevelopment if we need to, if our development patterns are showing such sprawl that's actually going to be impacting our waterways. This data can also be used to integrate a variety of different plans that folks are doing already in their localities. Folks are working on resilience plans, hazard mitigation plans, plans to address water quality, whether it's a TMDL action plan or an implementation plan. All of this data can be used to cohesively throughout all of these plans. And I'm not going to talk about smart growth because I don't have a lot of experience in that, but I do think that planning ahead and using what's passed as prologue is something that we can really be informed from checking out this data. So that's all I'm going to say. I know that it was a lot. I appreciate the time, the opportunity to provide these introductions. I think we're going to be hearing a lot from all the other experts in the field doing this work, but I really encourage you to check out the data, and that's it. So thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Casey. I think we're going to have a poll question here. If you could stop sharing your screen, I think we're going to do that next. But yeah, thanks, Casey, for that, because really it is critical to know. I mean, to have this data, to have these monitoring programs to see how well we're doing. Like, are the mitigation efforts we're working on, are they working? It's a report card for us. And you mentioned not speaking too much about the smart growth tools. Well, I hope that's a good segue into the next talk, because I'm going to talk about that a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of that hierarchy you discussed, in terms of like the planning kind of working its way to the water quality and that nexus there. So hopefully we can achieve that. And you should be able to see the poll. So if you could go ahead and, okay, looks like, all right, we're on it. So it looks like I can just read these for you. It looks like the majority of our respondents have not downloaded the data from the Chesapeake Bay program. So myself included, it looks like something that we could all learn more about and to go download that. And it looks like the majority of us, it would be, relevant to our work. So thanks for participating in that. We're going to move on now to the next discussion, which is Chesapeake Bay watershed protection in Delaware. And I'm going to invite Jennifer Walls to come on with me. You obviously heard my introduction, but my co-presenter today is Jen Walls, and she's a principal planner with DENREC, which is the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control with Delaware. She's with the Division of Watershed Stewardship. And for the last 20 years, she's been involved in the development and implementation of watershed implementation and pollution control strategies to address TMDLs in Delaware. And that is why she's on here with me to speak about those the environmental pieces. She has served as a key member of Delaware's Chesapeake Bay team for most of that time. She has worked with state, local, federal, and nonprofit partners to develop and implement strategies, including those related to low impact development, green infrastructure, and local land use to improve water quality in Delaware. She's a graduate of the University of Delaware's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources with a degree in Natural Resources Management, and served in the United States Coast Guard Reserve for 9 years as a Marine Service technician. So with that, we will go ahead, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so hopefully we can all see this. Hopefully we can see the slide and presenter view. Jen, can I get a thumbs up if we're good? All right, good. So, Jen and I are going to talk today about Delaware. And when we want to do this webinar, we really wanted to kind of give some Delaware specific examples of smart growth tools and resources, that we have both from the planning side, strictly land use, location-based planning, and then, environmental programs as well. So I'll start off with just a quick map of the portion of the watershed that appears in Delaware, and that is here in red on the map on the left. And then the map on the right, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in greater detail, but you can see that the upper and lower Chesapeake Bay watershed covers, roughly 30% or so. Jen might know a more exact number, but of the land area in Delaware. And it's interesting because you can see that our more developed areas are on the Delaware Bay side. And then you have our, predominantly rural and agricultural areas more on the upper and lower on the Chesapeake side, which, obviously, based on KC's discussion, creates its own problems when we have a lot of agricultural land. But also, it's important for us for the Chesapeake Bay watershed to make sure we have proper land use and smart growth planning within these areas to make sure we don't have a lot of the urban encroachment. So we'll start off with just a planning framework. And, this is similar to a lot of areas, but I know every state and locality is different. So in this framework, I'm going to be talking about the comprehensive plan as a tool, as well as Delaware's state strategies for policies and spending, and then the preliminary land use service, and all the ways that those tools help us direct and guide land use decisions. And then Jen's going to talk about kind of the the state programs and plans that feed into that process. And also, she's more knowledgeable about the federal and state regulations regarding watershed protection and water quality. So all of this fits together to inform the local land use authority decision-making process. So I'll touch on this briefly. I assume that the majority of people on this call are familiar with comprehensive plan, but just for the Delaware framework, obviously it's an important tool for us, because our 60 local governments have to update their plan every 10 years. And it requires that future land use map, that growth plan. And any of the communities that have greater than 2,000 persons, they also have to have strategies, goals, objectives, and strategies regarding, how they're going to protect the natural environment and how they're going to manage their wastewater systems, so that we don't have, too much impervious surface, so that we don't have, on-site septic systems and so forth. So really, the main benefit of this tool, as you can imagine, is it helps set the framework for managed growth. And it also helps direct growth to areas that has infrastructure, and discourage it from areas that are, more rural in nature and would make us, sprawl. So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the state strategies, because really this is the way that we, one of the ways that we sort of work with the local governments to implement their plans. And this is a policy document that is endorsed by the governor of Delaware and, by executive order every 5 years. And it essentially breaks all of the land area in Delaware into 5 different categories, which I'll get into in the next couple of slides. And the main benefit of that is it coordinates the land use decisions with the provision of state services. The bulk of infrastructure in Delaware is provided by the state, which is different than some other states where there's more of a local focus. So land use decisions made at the local level. State resources such as transportation facilities and school funding, just to name 2, are at the state level. So the strategies level, the strategies is a resource for local governments to say, this is where the state believes that growth is smartest. This is where we want to invest money in state services and infrastructure, and it coordinates that land use. And then of course we monitor how well we're doing by tracking development trends and collecting that from the towns and mapping that data. So it is a very intense spatial analysis that takes growth layers, it adds those, takes all the preservation and conservation layers and subtracts those, approximately 40 different layers in a GIS and mapping program. And just to briefly go through it, not to list every layer, but areas where we have planned growth, utilities, emergency services, public services, all those areas where the areas have planned and are more prepared for growth go into the first cut, or I guess the addition. And then all the natural lands, for resiliency and sustainability, ag lands, areas where growth should be limited, is put into the second piece, and those are layers that are excluded. And when you do that, you essentially get, this is, obviously a high level view of the map, but essentially this is the kind of Newcastle County, Sussex County, Kent County are 3 counties in Delaware. That's the way the map ends up looking. And I will show you the levels in more detail, but essentially you can see that all of the areas along the coast, for example, are considered the out of play areas that really should be left natural, and so forth. And then you have your more urban areas in red. So putting that into perspective for the Chesapeake Bay watershed, you can see that going back to the map I first showed, you can see that level 1 areas are areas that are in a municipality or within the growth and annexation area where you expect to have growth. And then level 2 in orange is where you would also expect to have some infill development or development around the fringe of the town. Level 3 areas in yellow are the suburban areas. And there are some environmental constraints there, so we want to see limited growth in those areas. And everything that's not showing on the map would be level 4, where we don't want to see growth, and then out of play, which are the protected lands. So you can see here, as I mentioned before, in Delaware, we have a sort of a growth corridor in the lower Chesapeake Bay watershed, and then you can see there that largely fed by the Nanticoke River here. So these are the areas where we've really got to make sure that we don't sprawl out of control, and that we kind of keep our development confined to those areas where they're most appropriate, where it's most appropriate, and where the state working with Jen and Denwick, is prepared to handle that growth. So one of the ways that we implement the state strategies is through the preliminary land use service. And that is a state agency review of land use proposals based on thresholds. So like at the baseline is greater than 50 units or greater than 50,000 square feet of commercial. And when those, they're required by state code to be reviewed by our office, the Office of State Planning Coordination. And then, like Jen's colleagues at DenRec, they review all of the development proposals with us. It informs all the developers about all the regulations that they're required to follow, but it also provides another critical piece. One of the main benefits of this program is it provides recommendations that are critical to protecting environmental resources. So it may be, we can assist with the design process and try to, inform them of best practices. So they can, design the sites to be least impactful. Now, does it always work? No. I mean, sometimes, developers can make the decisions, right, as long as they meet code. But this is definitely a tool to continue to work on these smart growth principles. And I'll try to wrap this up quickly so Jen can have some time. So one of the other implementation tools for us in the state are the downtown development districts. We have currently have 12 districts. And, like the name suggests, they're in downtown areas. And it is an incentive program that tries to promote private investment in downtown areas. And of course, the benefit of that would be to encourage the infill redevelopment of downtowns, those level 1 areas I talked about, and also to discourage the sprawling development in strategy levels 3 to 4. So that's a lot to get through, but now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk about DenRec's programs and how they can help promote smart growth and reduce the impacts to water quality. So take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Josh. So you've heard about sort of the Chesapeake land use tools Casey talked about, and Josh has talked about our state strategies and tools that we have. So we also utilize the TMDL and watershed implementation plans to manage water quality and manage growth. So the TMDL and the plans, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought, I apologize. So we've been working on the Chesapeake Bay plan for 20 plus years. It does provide accountability features to the state. We have worked to incorporate the TMDL and our implementation plans into the plus process that Josh mentioned. We also utilize that comprehensive plan process as well to encourage local governments to consider water quality management as a priority within their communities. We've also taken advantage of this process, I guess you could say, to help us in revising and revamping some of our state regulations, particularly incorporating some of voluntary recommendations or recommendations from stakeholders to strengthen regulations related to stormwater and wastewater. So we've taken those efforts kind of through this TMDL process and tried to strengthen those regulations statewide. We do have water quality concerns throughout the entire state. And so the Chesapeake Bay, while it covers a third of the state, we've utilized that to expand to cover other areas as well, as far as improvements. In the Chesapeake Bay, we're looking at 25% reductions in nitrogen, 24% reduction in phosphorus, and about 20% in sediment overall. As you saw on the map that Josh presented, the bulk of our watershed, the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Delaware, is agriculture. There's only about 10% that's developed, and that does create challenges for us because in the ag sector, practices that can be implemented are really on a voluntary basis. And so we have to take advantage of a lot of outreach and marketing, as well as cost share opportunities through partners such as NRCS and the conservation districts. We also work very closely with our municipalities to provide technical assistance and to encourage implementation of practices that will address nutrients from that sector. And you'll hear about some of that work when Ed gives his presentation. We do have a deadline of 2025 to meet our TMDL goals in the Chesapeake. So we're kind of on this downward, the downward slide, I guess you could say. Part of the Bay TMDL effort and the Chesapeake Bay program effort, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, there's also this process of 2-year milestones. And so we take advantage of those milestones, and we use those milestones to help us stay on track with our implementation. And some of the things that we include in our milestones are related to providing that technical assistance I mentioned for things like MS4, municipal stormwater regulations to our local governments. We have outreach opportunities and programs that encourage homeowners to limit, nutrient applications to their lawns. And in other parts of the state, some of those practices will go much further than they may in the Chesapeake, just because of the land use that we're dealing with. So some of the other practices that we have focused on for the next couple of years, or we have planned for the next couple of years, include focusing on and encouraging conservation, landscape practices, tree plantings in urban and rural areas. We're working on a riparian buffer strategy. I think one item that will go a long way in helping us to maybe achieve that is Sussex County has recently adopted an ordinance to require riparian buffers along wetlands. So we'll be hoping to take advantage of some of the work that they're doing, partnering with them to complete some analysis of the potential impact of that. But that was a huge benefit, I think a huge benefit, and a long time coming to get that ordinance on the ground. So we appreciate the efforts of partners and our municipal governments that work with us very closely to get this work done. Josh, can you move to the next slide for me, please? And I mentioned technical assistance and funding. So, in order to get these practices on the ground, particularly voluntary practices, we need financial and technical resources, and we've made those available to our local governments to implement the strategies and we do that through grants and cost share assistance. We have provided funds, for infrastructure upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant level, septic system, individual septic system level, stormwater management, green infrastructure, all of those things. And then we work very closely with NRCS and our conservation district partners as well to provide cost share assistance to farmers who are interested in implementing practices. We also work closely with our forestry section in the Department of Ag. They have a urban forestry program that we work very closely with to encourage planting of trees. And we're again working with our urban partners to do that. We also try to utilize our Chesapeake Bay funding to leverage other projects and other funding sources. So we because we're a small state, I think it makes things, sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to get some of that done as well. A couple other new things I didn't put this together on the slide, but it also related to kind of this overall topic of tools for protecting the Bay watershed. And back in November, our governor signed and our secretary signed off on our Delaware Climate Action Plan. And one of the components of that action plan is a program called Trees for Every Delawarean Initiative. And so we've also incorporated the work, kind of that effort into our TMDL and Chesapeake Bay milestones. And what the TEDI program does is it developed a tracker and outreach to folks who are interested in planting trees to be able to track where those tree planting activities are happening. And we can I'll post the link to that in the chat here before the end of the session. But it's a pretty neat opportunity to track where trees are being planted, provide outreach, and to help folks understand some of the impacts of climate change, and in turn as well water quality. So we try to take advantage of all of the opportunities that we can. I think that's the end of my slides. Josh, did you want me to?
Yeah, no, that's.
I don't want to get us off track on time.
Yeah, that's all right. That's it. And we're already, I think we're already kind of running over. But
Yeah.
what we'll do is we'll just flash these real quick and show you that we did include resources from the Office of State Planning and resources from DENREC. And of course, those slides will go out. So don't obviously worry about, capturing that. Those slides will go out. And then of course, if you have any questions, Jen and I you can always email us and we'll get back to you. So thank you, Jen. Sorry if I compressed us, it's a lot of information to get out there. And, it's being recorded and all that good stuff. So we can follow up with questions later. So thank you, Jen. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Ed Lewandowski. Hopefully, Ed, you're okay with me abbreviating the bio just a little bit to get us back on track. And I will put it, I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. But let me stop sharing my screen here. All right, Ed, you should be able to share yours now. Ed is a coastal communities development specialist with the Delaware Sea Grant Marine Advisory Service at UD. Prior to joining the university, he spent 13 years with the nonprofit Center for the Inland Bays, the Delaware Inland Bays National Estuary Program, serving as its executive director for a time. He holds a master's degree in organizational leadership and obtained his undergraduate degree in marine biology. So hopefully that was an okay abbreviation, Ed, and we welcome you to the stage.
Wanishi, Josh, Wanishi, thank you. So Osio, everyone, Osio, hello, Wi'i Kanawash, good to see you. So these are Nanticoke greetings. For those of you who are not familiar, the Nanticoke are the indigenous people of Southern Delaware. Now, if it was 1879 and you were a Nanticoke child enrolled at the Carlisle Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, you would not have been allowed to speak those words. The Carlisle School was the first off-reservation Native American boarding school in this country, and it served as the principal model for more than 350 other schools that followed. Canada even modeled its schools after ours. The founder of the Carlisle School was a retired military veteran named Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. Now, Pratt is infamous for having once said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." I guess that could be interpreted as destroy the race, but keep the warm body around for hard labor. Now, the objective of Pratt's schools was to assimilate or civilize Native American youth into Euro-American society. So how was this achieved? Well, first, many students or children were forcibly removed from their families and their reservation. And essentially their cultural identity was stripped. When they arrived at the school, they were given English names. Their hair was cut to a standard style and length. And for the boys, this meant that their ponytails, their culturally important ponytails, were chopped off. All the students were required to wear the same uniforms. Look at the photo and you can see that homogeneity became the norm. They were also asked to remember the names of the US presidents, and they were absolutely prohibited from speaking their native tongue. And if caught doing so, the punishment could be very severe. One such punishment was to insert metal pins into the tongue of the offenders. I said pins, plural, not pin. Now, after about 7 to 10 days, when the scar tissue in the tongue began to harden, these pins would be unceremoniously ripped out. So it was atrocities such as this that really began the demise of the Native American language here in this country, and that included the Nanticoke language. I was unaware of these atrocities that occurred at the Native American boarding school. I'd read a little bit in the headlines over the past couple of years about some burial sites that were discovered that were associated with these schools. But this story was shared with me by Raggy Callentine, and Raggy is a traditional storyteller with the Nanticoke tribe. And she was sharing this story to express to me how important this project at Tidewater Park was to her people, because it was helping them to resurrect their Native American language. So what does this have to do with Chesapeake Bay smart growth strategies? Well, this project began as a land use planning and water quality effort. It was back in 2012 when I rode into Laurel, Delaware with Jen Walls and a couple of other colleagues. And we were there to develop a Chesapeake Phase 2 Watershed Implementation Plan, or WIP. So we engaged community officials and stakeholders in some land use growth and development planning using Community Viz Scenario 360. We then aligned the growth and development that the community desired with potential strategies for the required nutrient offsets. And when we finished this work, and it took us several months to get to a point where the community was comfortable with the land use scenarios and the proposed offsets. But when we finished this work, that stakeholder group, those same people we just worked with, made a request of us. They said, help us bring people and jobs back to downtown Laurel. No simple task. So to start, we led a public conversation, and that eventually resulted in a landscape level design for waterfront redevelopment along the Broad Creek. And that plan was called the Ramble. It was produced by Dr. Jules Bruck, who is my colleague and just left us for the University of Florida, where she's now the director of the landscape architecture program down there. But she did this plan with one of her grad students, and the plan, as you see it on the screen, was adopted by the town council in 2014. Now, one of the proposed components was a nature play area that was originally named Governor's Park and Independence Playground. 5 former governors of Delaware hailed from Laurel, so it seemed like a fitting tribute. But as we dug a little deeper into the history of the property, we realized that the Nanticoke people were the original inhabitants of Laurel, Delaware. And furthermore, about 3,000 acres along the Broad Creek were set aside as a reservation in 1705. Now, unfortunately, that reservation was stripped away from them in 1768 by the colonial government, and that began the Great Migration of the Nanticoke people northward. So we changed our direction with this project now that we had this understanding, and we renamed that parcel Tidewater Park, because the word Nanticoke translates as Tidewater people or people of the Tidewaters. But we still wanted to focus on a nature-based play theme. So Jules suggested that the play features that should go there should reflect the folklore of the Nanticoke tribe. Now, Tidewater Park sits on about 4.5 acres of land that was once mostly turf grass with a few trees, and the area was subject to standing water during heavy rainfalls because it drained about 2.5 acres of impervious surface. And we were fortunate enough to receive some grant monies from DENREC to do some stormwater feasibility studies, as well as a phase 1 environmental assessment, and then some surface water planning so that we could come up with a design for that site. And after an initial environmental assessment, an engineer with Foresight Associates, Drew Hayes, came up with the concept of putting in a bioswale and a constructed wetland. And you can see that conceptual drawing. And what's really cool about this, if you look at the bioswale, it's in the shape of a snake, and that was intentional. He did that to honor some of the folklore of the Nanticokes as well. I can't recall the nutrient reduction, the volumes of water treated, and how many pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus are removed, but it was significant. And so the project was appealing from that aspect. But it is around these stormwater treatments that this nature-based play area is being installed. And there are 4 components to that. We worked with Compton Incorporated. They are one of the world's leaders in designing play elements, active play elements. So they created some incredibly unique nature play elements for our park. There are 4 stories that we are featuring. Phase 1 of the Nanticoke stories is Turtle Island, the story of creation. And then we have How the Beaver Got Its Tail. These features were installed last October. At each play piece, you see the beaver there. It's a piece that came from custom made out of the Czech Republic. But each play piece has associated with it an interpretive panel. And that panel shares an excerpt of the story as told by the ancestors. And it has a glossary of Nanticoke words that are included in the story. So if you scan that QR code, what you will be led to is a YouTube video, and you'll get to hear Raggy Callantine, the traditional storyteller, tell that story in its entirety using some of her native tongue. So phase 1 is done. This summer, we will be installing next month a swing set component, as well as a 30 by 30 shade sail structure, which is important on a parcel that is really baked by the sun daily. But the big news for us, you can see is the future phases here. That is Rainbow Crow, the story of Rainbow Crow. Folks, that is a 30-foot tall crow with a 16-foot tall crow with a 30-foot wingspan. And then you see the story of Squirrel Council. So the big news for us is that these two play components, Rainbow Crow and Squirrel Council, have been included by both of our US senators in their CDS requests, their congressionally directed spending request for the proposed federal budget. So assuming that Congress does what it's constitutionally mandated to do and passes a federal budget this year, this project could be potentially completed by fall of 2023. We would then be able to invite back Chief Natasha Carmine from the Nendico tribe, as well as the spiritual leader Herman Jackson, to again bless the park with a spiritual blessing. So if you'd like to learn more about Tidewater Park and participate in a virtual tour, you can scan that QR code that is on your screen right now, and it will take you to a Round Me 360 virtual tour that is fairly comprehensive, and you get a good feel for what's planned, what is currently there, and some of the other elements that we've been working with along the Broad Creek. So I just want to acknowledge all of the following, and we can add Senator Chris Coons and Senator Tom Carper to that list as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate it. Well, and you helped get us back on schedule. So we appreciate that. Fascinating story. We're going to move on. Looks like we got questions coming in the Q&A, so we'll move on to Paul, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some live questions at the end. So Paul, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you as our final speaker for this lunch hour. Paul DesJardin is I'm going to talk about planning for growth in metropolitan Washington. He's the director of the Department of Community Planning and Services of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, the regional organization of the DC metro area local governments, plus area members of Maryland and Virginia's legislatures, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. He leads COG's work in regional planning and land use. He's been with COG for 35 years, so welcome, Paul.
All right, thank you, Josh. Share my screen here. Come on, there we go. You seeing that?
You're
okay?
good to go.
Good, thanks. All right, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. And when Laura asked me to be a part of this, she did ask me how long I've been at COG. It's interesting, I have been there a long time, and I actually overlapped when Governor Glendening teed up the whole concept of smart growth, and have since worked with a number of his original smart growth cabinet members. So it's something that's really pretty much ingrained into our DNA and what we do at COG. A couple things, I'll talk very briefly about what COG is, and I know the slides will be available after this, so I'll go through this pretty quickly and try and keep it kind of high level. I'll talk a little bit about forecasting growth in the region, because I actually want to say, as you see in that next bullet, we actually have some smart growth constructs that we have adopted at COG that I'm actually pretty optimistic that we are actually doing a pretty good job when it comes to planning for land use and growth. And then lastly, I want to focus just a little bit, and this really is front and center for me when it comes to any conversations about growth, the economy, land use, what have you. It's the uncertainty of what does the world look like post-COVID. Whoops, wrong direction. So this is COG, this is our footprint. We're smaller than the MSA. About 300 elected officials are our members, as Josh said, from local, state, and congressional delegations. We're also the MPO for transportation planning, and it's really important because since 1990, with the first passage of surface transportation legislation, I've spent the lion's share of my career in conversations talking about how to focus growth, how it can best be accommodated, principally from a transportation standpoint, but also how it makes sense fiscally for local government. So essentially, why is smart growth important? Whoops, keep going the wrong way. Very quickly, if you go to our website, and I can put a link in the chat, these are some examples of some major priorities for COG over the last few years. We had a huge lift 3 years ago at this time, working with a number of our partners on housing targets. A couple of years ago, many of you remember, we were successful in attracting the Amazon HQ2 headquarters to Arlington County. And one of the things we learned through that process, they came in and they said, you know, you guys aren't the Bay Area, you're not Boston or New York, but you guys really have to get a handle on this housing affordability problem. And so we took it on, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, about not just the amount, but where the housing needs to go. Because again, we are all about the spatial relationships, the dynamic system of how the region functions. Again, linking housing and growth to transportation, but also preservation of open space and our environment. A couple other bullets on there. We adopted a climate plan and action goals 2 years ago. And then I'll talk in a few minutes too about these other spatial constructs, what I would argue are, again, sort of smart growth lenses called high capacity transit stations and equity emphasis areas. So real quickly about our forecast, this is a schematic of how the process works. It's been in place since the 70s when the planning directors agreed they wanted a consistent set of growth projections for our region to guide local and regional planning, capital improvements programs, investment in transportation and infrastructure and whatnot. We call it a top-down, bottom-up process, the top being this blue box, which is an econometric model that says, if you roll everything together from an econometric standpoint, this is the maximum amount of growth the Washington region would get. The strength of the process, though, is this red box here. Since the 70s, on a fairly regular basis, we engage with our local governments and the surrounding jurisdictions beyond our footprint to take a look at, in the near term, what's being approved in permitting activity, where dirt's being turned, permits being issued, but also where growth is planned for and can be accommodated through comprehensive and small area plans. We reconcile those projections and roll it into a consistent set of growth forecasts for the 3,000 or so traffic zones that are our modeling foundation. Very similar, sort of lens that other regions undertake. So here's our forecast, the most recent, we're just approved. We're looking at about 881,000 more jobs, about 1.3 million more people, about 536,000 households. So a couple things, this is, slower growth than we've seen in the past, but one thing that's important, and it goes back to this, where can growth best be accommodated and how can it best be served? Because when you look at the forecast, jobs in sheer number and rate are growing faster than the households that will provide the workers to fill those jobs. And that really was the underpinning of the conversation we had when we set our housing targets, that we are really, not only have we become a region where residential growth, housing construction has become unaffordable, it's going to be an economic detriment to our region and the successes we've had. So very quickly, these are a couple charts showing you what does that pattern of growth look like. So the light pinkish rose color there in each bar shows the number of jobs that were on the ground in a particular jurisdiction in the year 2020. And then the darker red shows you what that jurisdiction is anticipating over the next 25 years, between 2020 and 2045. So again, you see the district would have the greatest number of jobs, or did rather, followed by Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George's counties. And then again, you can see the red increments here showing the amount of growth expected in each of those jurisdictions over the next couple of years. I apologize, my dogs have discovered the dogs next door. A couple things I point out to you is look at the relative scale here. This is what's on the ground, and this is the increment of what is expected to be added over the next few years, next 25 years rather. Similar for household growth. Fairfax County, Montgomery, Prince George's, the district, and at that order for the total number of households that are on the ground in 2020, and then the darker blue portion showing the increment of growth that's expected over the next 25 years. So I bring that up in the context, you can see it here, and I'll show you a couple maps in a second that really drive this home. We talk a lot about growth, and we have very bad transportation problems, we have housing affordability problems, but here's the hard fact, and I mentioned this to my co-panelists when we were playing the session. 80% of 2045 is on the ground right now. We spend a lot of time talking about alternative scenarios and what can we do to influence the future, which is what we should do because we're a planning organization. But the hard reality is so much of the future is here now, and we're actually faced with having to be very strategic about what can we do to influence that. So a couple quick maps that will emphasize that. This is 2015 and 2015 to 2045, slightly different time frame, but this is employment. The lighter rose-colored dots show jobs that were on the ground. Each one of those is 500 jobs that were on the ground in 2015. The darker red that you can see is what's projected over the next 25 years. And you can see some very distinct patterns going right through the middle of the district, out the Roslyn-Ballston corridor here in Arlington. That triangle, that's Tyson's Corner, that's the I-270 corridor in Montgomery County. But if you look at the map, it's very focused, it's very concentrated. And I'll talk a little bit more about goals that we've set regarding that in just a second. This is the companion, and this really is the challenge when we have these conversations about growth and smart growth and focusing and linking growth in making capital investments. This is households. Light blue dots are 500, each one is 500 households in the year 2015. The darker blue dots are what is expected between 2015 and 2045. Same thing though, if you look at the darker blue dots, it's actually very focused. Again, there's the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. There's Tyson's Corner. This is heading out towards Reston and Herndon, the I-270 corridor. What we are planning for in the future is actually very focused, and that really, again, speaks to the heart of the foundation of our local government plans and some goals and aspirations that we set out in the future. And that's what I want to talk really briefly about here right now. This is a document called Region Forward. It's our vision plan, our comprehensive plan, our regional plan, whatever you want to call it, that my team and I developed going back to 2010. Any good plan, it has growth, or I'm sorry, it has different domains, different pillars, if you will, these different goal areas for land use, transportation, the economy, but it's all wrapped around these sort of pillars, if you will, of prosperity, accessibility, livability, and sustainability. So it's a very real vision that really drives every part of our work program at the Council of Governments, both on the technical side and on the policy side. And so one of the things that I mentioned before, and I showed you the maps and the forecasts about growth, this is focusing, again, from Region Forward. When we compiled that document, I mentioned before, growth areas in each one, or goals and targets in each one of these nine broad themes. So we have targets and indicators, metrics that we agreed, we put our hands over our hearts and said, we're going to try and do our best to achieve those different goals in the economy or in transportation or what have you. So let me focus on accessibility, because this really goes to the heart, again, of how we have really tried to take on the idea of smart growth and focusing growth the way you saw it in those maps. So we looked at an indicator from the Center for Neighborhood Technology. Many of you are familiar with it. It's about the two biggest costs that a household is burdened with, which is housing and transportation costs. We actually set a goal that these places, these priority places like what you see depicted here, which is a rendering of Tyson's Corner, we set goals and said, in these priority places, we don't want housing and transportation costs to exceed 45% of AMI. I mean, if you think about it, that's linking transportation, income, and housing affordability all in one particular goal, but it's a spatial one. But related again to this form and function of what are we trying to do in metropolitan Washington to really, really focus growth in the right places. We took a pledge when we adopted Region Forward that 3/4 of all the future job growth that we measure through commercial construction and half of the region's residential growth, household growth, would also be in activity centers. So keep in mind, these activity centers, there's 141 of them. It's places like Silver Spring, like Bethesda, like Tyson's, like Largo. They're very, very small. They're only about 9% of the region's land area. So we are focusing the majority of future growth, as you saw in those maps, but more deliberatively, we have agreed that is what we want to do. That's where we want to focus growth. And the good news is when we've looked at the actual trends, this was a pledge that we laid out 10 years ago. We're definitely on track with commercial development, job growth, definitely at 75% there. We're actually doing even better than what we pledged for residential growth. We're at more like 65% of household growth is going into these priority places called activity centers. And that really, as I said, from where I sit, is a very good thing when it comes to planning construct. And the last little bullet on here, all of those activity centers, our goal is that they would be served by transit, high capacity transit, BRT, Metro Rail, commuter rail, the gamut of things. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago about our housing targets. Again, we began that journey with the finding from the Amazon folks about housing becoming an economic development impediment. So our board of directors adopted 3 targets. Here's the first one. We said over the next 10 years, between 2020 and 2030, this region needs to produce 320,000 total housing units. And as you can see there, that's 75,000 more total units than what is already being anticipated in our growth projections. So they said, we really want to lean in. 245,000 wasn't enough. We need 320,000 to really provide workers for the jobs that we believe are coming to this region. Why? To take the pressure off of our overburdened transportation system, to take the pressure off of our overburdened utilities and really focus in to neighborhoods and areas that can support future growth. To go 2 steps further, the second goal, 75% of all new housing should be in an activity center or near high capacity transit. Again, places where local governments have made the investment in infrastructure, where they are hoping to plan for future growth. We're saying it's in there. This is what we want to do. So the board leaned in and they said, we don't want it everywhere. We want the majority of it in these right places. So instead of 50% of housing, they increased it and said 75% of housing. Again, 75% of jobs was already the target. And the last one, and this really is the hardest one, 75% of all the new housing should be affordable to low and middle income households. So let's think about this. First, we're talking from the top level, 50,000 foot level, how much growth and where do we want it? Then we're saying, not only do we want it in priority places, and we really want to do the right thing and focus this and make it affordable to workers across the spectrum. And it's really hard. And this is why I'm going to point it out. So to hit those targets, this red line, we need to do about 32,000 units a year, 320,000 units over 10 years. That's about what would work out. This blue line below shows you the number of residential permits that are actually being issued. We've been bumping along in the low 20s for at least the last 2.5 years. It's funny, if you look far off to the left on this slide, 1987, when places like Burke and Chantilly and Gaithersburg and Upper Marlboro were being built out, we were doing more like 40,000 units a year. Why is that important? Because if you take away nothing else from what I say, we are a mature region. And so we are trying to be strategic to think about where can we best focus and accommodate growth. Talked about the housing targets before, but again, here, this is the bad news. We're not hitting them. And every year that we fail to hit this 32,000 number puts us that much farther behind. So that's a challenge that just continues to grow even before the pandemic. So real quickly, and I'll wrap up here in just a minute. What about the pandemic? So this, as I said, it's the kind of thing that keeps me awake all night, and is part of my job, is sort of thinking through what is the future, because I'm here to tell you, nobody really knows what is the new normal. It's yet to be determined. We lost 370, we have, my screen's in the way here, sorry. We lost 373,000 jobs in 1 month when the pandemic started. 11% of our jobs, it was like somebody pulled the floor out from beneath us. We've clawed our way back. We're about 98, 99% 2 years into the pandemic. So yes, we've added jobs, but only to get us back to where we were. Another indicator that we track, and again, this relates to economic activity, it relates to locational decisions and whatnot. There's a company in Arlington called Cattell, and what they do is they provide data. They provide security services to buildings in the form of electronic security cards. So what you're looking at here is in the red line, the card swipes, if you will, of people going back into their office building from last September all the way up through just 2 weeks ago. We are below the national average by 3 or 4 points, but the bottom line, only about 40% of us are going back into the office. So there's benefits to that. You know, the traffic system, and I'll talk about that in a second, isn't as full, but it starts to beg the question of investments that local governments are making into approving commercial office space. If you're only going to be back in the office 3 days a week, it doesn't take a smart person too long to figure out that maybe if you are in charge of your lease, you might decide you don't need quite as much space. And that has very real fiscal implications. Related to this, and this goes to the heart of locational decisions when it comes to where are people choosing to work in metropolitan Washington in a really expensive housing market. This is from a survey our transportation staff did called Voices of the Region. And what you can see here, and it's not a shock to anybody in this forum, 2/3 of people said, you know, I would really like to telework some days and commute to work, you know, occasionally. 9%, less than 1 out of every 10 said, oh, heck yes, sign me up. I really, really want to go back to work, commute into the office full time forever. Just isn't going to happen. Real quickly, you know, I mentioned transportation impacts of COVID. You can see here on the left-hand side how traffic volumes fell at the height, you know, 50% lower April of 2020 versus April of 2019. By December of last year, which is what we're looking at over here, traffic was actually back up to about 95, 96% of what it had been in December of 2020 or 2019 rather. So, you know, transportation traffic is coming back, but transit use isn't yet. And when I work for an organization that really, really wants to focus growth in and around transit hubs, this is kind of an important thing to track. This is only through February of this year, and I was real pleased to see that WMATA is rolling out the new rail cars that they had problems with, that they're coming back online. But if you look at this, I mean, service is still way below where it had been before. Metro Rail is only at about 30% of what it had been before the pandemic. Metro Bus, and this was a good thing, throughout the pandemic, so many of the essential workers were so dependent on the bus. And so what you can see there is 2/3 of Metro Bus riders really, really at pre-pandemic levels. So very quickly, I'm going to wrap up here. I told you we are focusing in on what are some of these different drivers of future land use investment, future land use planning and growth and investment decisions, the spatial form of where growth is going to occur. We're obviously going to look at a range of economic forecasts, what COVID might do in the near term or long term to metropolitan Washington's growth. We're pretty much insulated from really, really bad things in the federal presence. But here's a fun fact. Federal civilian employment is pretty much the exact same number of jobs that it was in 1980. What changed was federal spending, federal procurement spending to purchase goods and services went from $2 to $5 billion in 1980 to $82 billion just a few years ago. And so that is what has driven a lot of our suburban activity centers. What I don't know if folks even remember, Joel Garreau wrote a book a while ago about edge cities. That is what drove that type of pattern of growth in metropolitan Washington. We also want to look at potential changes to future average household size, but this second bullet, office and retail space usage. I mentioned it before. If you are teleworking, if you're hot seating, if you are just not coming into the office as much, that puts a damper on the need for office space, which means if you have a building and you have a big employer in it, maybe that employer steps back and only needs 2/3 as much space. That means you got to find another employer to backfill the space that used to be occupied by the original tenant. And then lastly, and I alluded to this with the telework, we are working on trying to get a handle on the impact of the timing, location, and the amount of future housing growth. As I said, our housing affordability problem is kind of an Achilles heel from an economic development standpoint, but the corollary to that is, you know, I like to say a job is what you do, it's not where you go. So if you or your partner are only going to the office 2 or 3 days, or maybe you might seriously think about looking at a house, place to live that's 25, 30, maybe 50 miles farther out than you previously were looking into. So that to me, again, is one of those unanswered questions about, you know, future growth. Then lastly, a couple of other constructs. I talked about, that we do look at things from a smart growth lens. For environmental justice on the MPO, the transportation side, we have created and identified, I should say, these 350 census tracts that you see mapped here. We call them equity emphasis areas. It's places, as you see, that have a very high or a higher than regional average concentration of low income and or minority populations. And so why do we do this? Because we want to make sure we don't fail to invest in these communities, but also we want to make sure the corollary, we want to make sure we don't do bad things like, we all know from planning school when highways plowed through neighborhoods and just totally destroyed communities. So not that we're in risk of doing anything like that, but it's that same being mindful of doing good and not doing bad. And then lastly, I talked about this before, high capacity transit stations. We have 225 of them. This is a priority for our board. Again, I would argue this is a smart growth construct where the region's transit systems have made billions of dollars investments in all of the modes that you see there. And again, these are the metrics where we are trying to focus future growth. Again, 75% of all the future housing and job growth should be located in or around any one of these places. So lastly, I'll put in a plug here. And again, I'll put this all in the chat. This is our most recent document that really codifies all of this, where it talks about the fact that prosperity, accessibility, livability, and sustainability, everything's integrated. It's a system. We have climate goals, we have housing, we have transportation goals, and we have equity goals. And they really, really are all linked together. We're very proud of the work and would really commend that to your attention. So with that, I am going to stop. I hope I got us a little bit back more on track, although I'm looking and seeing we're getting close to end here. So let me stop and turn it back to Josh.
Thank you, Paul. It's fascinating. I'm really glad you brought up the whole impacts of telecommuting piece, because, it's something that concerns me too. And I didn't mention it during my talk, but, all the efforts we do to try to keep jobs and housing within the city centers and around, right? And it makes you wonder, is there going to be a trend that undermines that now with the wider acceptance of telecommuting and more of it happening? People can now change their decision making and say, oh, I'm just going to move further away because I can now. So it's definitely something that, we don't have a handle on yet. And we certainly need to keep that as part of the conversation. So I want to give a huge thank you to all of my fellow panelists. We don't have a lot of time for questions. The good news is we've been answering questions live in the Q&A, and I don't see any that are open and unanswered there. So that's fantastic. But I guess one quick thing is if we could have a couple seconds, if anybody has any thoughts on this. One of the questions Laura asked is, do any of the panelists have any advice about how they can make connections between smart growth and water quality, that planning and water quality link? So certainly, within the next couple seconds, if you had any thoughts on that.
I'll just jump in really quick and just say that's a tough one to tackle. And we as a regional entity try our best. Oftentimes things like resilience tend to bring a lot of those groups together. So having more discussions holistically.
Yeah, and I think just any type of professional groups you can join. I know there's the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League, there's RASCL in Delaware, that has definitely increased my knowledge of resiliency and environmental best practices and things in the state. So yeah, definitely any of those kind of connections you can make. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, I would recommend if you're interested in making those connections as a land use planner, take advantage of opportunities that your DEQ or DNR agencies may provide, and any kind of organizations like like what we have here, whether it be our PTAC group or planner technical advisory committees, things like that. Take advantage of getting involved or listening into their sessions to get more up to date on those issues.
Thank you for that. Oh, Ed, sure.
Say for Laurel, Delaware, the connection between healthy water quality and the ecological integrity of its broad creek is key to its future, to the economic development that it wishes. It's trying to position itself as a base camp to Nanticoke country, the Nanticoke being the river that drains the Chesapeake Bay. So highlighting that water quality is seen as something that might attract people to the town of Laurel to engage in those types of recreational activities.
Thank you, Ed.
To build off what Ed said, I think something that we've tried to be mindful of is those local connections. So for us here in Delaware, as a headwater state to the Chesapeake, many of the residents don't necessarily feel that connection that the folks in Maryland or Virginia may. So making connections to local water bodies, you know, at the local level and highlighting the issues, the local issues, I think is critical.
Fantastic. Well, I think I'm getting the look from Laura, like we need to wrap it up. So we're going to I'm going to turn it back over. But you know, the last thing I'll say just on behalf of the Delaware chapter, just thank you. Thank you on behalf of the collaboration too. And I just want to say, obviously this is being recorded. I'm happy we were able to answer most of the questions, but please reach out to us if you have anything further. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. So we just have, as usual, we have a lot of resources that'll be posted up on the Virginia APA website. And I want to turn it over to Laura Cattell Noll to close us out.
Thank you, Laura Backel. So as Laura mentioned, this is the last in a series of 6 webinars that were around planning for clean water. And so we have a few partners I just want to thank really quickly before we end today. I want to thank EPA and the Chesapeake Bay Program who helped to fund this series, and the Chesapeake Bay Trust who helped to administer the contract to do this work. And then, of course, our key partners in the project. We had a small steering committee for this work, which included members of the local leadership work group and the local government advisory committee. You've already heard Josh sing the praises of the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration, which has been just a phenomenal partner, including all the state chapters. Delaware was today's host, but we had a host from each of the other states for the other webinars, which was really amazing to see folks take that kind of ownership around it. So thank you to the Maryland, West Virginia, National Capital, Pennsylvania, and of course, Delaware chapters for helping to host. And a special shout out to the Virginia chapter who helped to run the tech. So thank you, Martina and Jillian, for their work in the background. That's essential. I also want to thank our speakers today, but also all the speakers from the whole series. I think we had more than 20 experts speaking through this series of 6 webinars, which was really amazing and fascinating. Thank you to our attendees, the ones in attendance today and previous events. And then lastly, thank you to Laura Backel from ERG, who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this series happen. So thank you all. Hopefully that was quick and painless, but you know, this work can't be done without partners. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.